Boy pulls elderly woman from a car crash. Her identity shocks everyone. A young boy rushed to pull an elderly woman from the wreckage. No one could have predicted the identity that would be uncovered, shaking the foundations of everything they knew. It was a quiet, crisp autumn afternoon in a sleepy suburban neighborhood. The golden hues of fall painted the trees, and the street was calm, save for the occasional rustling of leaves carried by the wind. The sun, hanging low in the sky, bathed the town in a soft, almost dreamlike glow. But this tranquility would be shattered in an instant. The intersection, once a mundane part of daily life for the locals, became the epicenter of chaos. A sudden deafening crash echoed across the street. A car, its rear end crumpled and tires smoking, came to a halt against a nearby lamppost. The once peaceful setting had become a scene of destruction. Among the first to arrive at the scene was 17-year-old Ethan Miller, a local high school student known for his kind heart and quick thinking. Ethan had been walking home when the accident occurred. Without hesitation, as Ethan pulled her from the wreckage, something in her purse caught his eye. A photo, one that would unravel a mystery far deeper than anyone could have imagined. As emergency responders arrived, Ethan stood by, trying to steady the shaken woman in his arms. Helen, though visibly shaken, seemed oddly composed, her gaze distant, as though she were lost in thought. She muttered something under her breath, words that Ethan couldn't make out. The paramedics quickly took over, whisking her away to the hospital, leaving behind a scene that would soon draw far more attention than any typical accident. But it wasn't just the crash that would consume the town. It was the photograph. As Ethan searched through the contents of Helen's purse for identification, his hand brushed against something hard, an old yellowed photograph of a man and a young girl, standing together in front of a large, imposing building. The image seemed out of place, tucked away among the woman's personal items. But it wasn't the photo that startled Ethan. It was the face of the man in the picture. The image was unmistakable. The man was a well-known, high-profile figure in the town, a man whose connection to Helen had never been mentioned, nor suspected. Who was she really? And why was she hiding this photo? What was the link between her and the powerful figure in town? The questions began to swirl, and a deep, unsettling sense of mystery began to settle over Ethan. This accident had been no ordinary crash. It was the spark that would ignite a story full of secrets, lies, and betrayal. Ethan Miller was, by all accounts, an ordinary teenager. He had been raised in the same quiet neighborhood his entire life, with a mother who worked as a nurse and a father who worked in construction. His world, though far from glamorous, was rooted in simplicity and honesty. Ethan was the type of person who would help anyone in need, often volunteering at local community events or assisting elderly neighbors with their groceries. His friends would describe him as kind-hearted, but someone who kept to himself more than others might realize. When the accident occurred, Ethan's first instinct had been to help. But his involvement in this story would turn out to be far more significant than he ever anticipated. His role as a witness, later becoming an unintentional kill. Helen wasn't just some harmless old woman. The photo Ethan found was a connection to the town's former mayor, Thomas Caldwell, a man who had held the town's highest office for over 2 decades. Thomas was known for his wealth, power, and influence. His name came with a certain aura of respect. But beneath the polished surface was a man with secrets. His reign as mayor had been unchallenged until whispers of corruption began to spread. It was said that he had ties to organized crime, that he had used his position for personal gain, and that there were rumors of his involvement in unsolved scandals from years ago. What role did Helen play in all of this? And why was she hiding her connection to him? What had Ethan uncovered? And what could it mean for the future of the town? It was a foggy Thursday afternoon when the accident happened. Ethan had been on his way to the local diner after school, a routine he followed most days. As he crossed the intersection near the outskirts of town, he witnessed the car crash that would change his life forever. The screeching tires and the sickening thud of metal against he called 911, his hands shaking as he described the situation, his mind racing with the feeling that something wasn't right. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but by then, the mystery had already begun to unfold. The woman, later identified as Helen Martin, was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Her injuries were severe: broken ribs, a fractured leg, and head trauma. But she was alive, which was the only thing that seemed certain in that moment. Detective Rachel Harris was the first investigator on the scene. She was a seasoned officer known for her keen instincts and relentless pursuit of the truth. As she surveyed the wreckage, her mind was already working through the possibilities. The scene had the signs of a simple accident, but something about it felt off. The skid marks on the road weren't consistent with the car's speed or trajectory. It was when Detective Harris inspected it at the hospital, she found something that made her pause. A photograph, hidden in the back of a compartment, of Helen standing alongside none other than Mayor Thomas Caldwell. It was an old picture, but it clearly showed their connection. Why was Helen carrying it? What was her relationship with the town's former mayor? The conflicting statements, the mysterious photograph, and the strange circumstances of the crash all pointed to something more than just a simple accident. Detective Harris knew this was no ordinary case, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. As the investigation progressed, more questions emerged than answers. Detective Rachel Harris found herself drowning in conflicting witness statements. One witness, a jogger who claimed to have seen the car moments before the crash, swore he saw a man in the driver's seat, not Helen. This, of course, made no sense. Helen had been alone, as far as anyone knew. The jogger's statement contradicted everyone else's, leaving the case in a deeper state of confusion. Then, there was the strange incident at the hospital. Detective Harris had just finished a routine interview with Helen's family when a nurse pulled her aside. In Helen's room, the woman had woken up briefly, only to be startled and agitated when she noticed the detective. She muttered something under her breath that no one could fully decipher, but it sounded like, "They can't find out." Greaves focused on the forensics, combing through the wreckage for physical evidence, but came up with little more than scattered debris. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. Lena had been tracking Caldwell's movements, but the mayor's alibi for the day of the crash seemed airtight. He'd been in a meeting with the city council for hours. But then came a breakthrough, though it wasn't one that anyone had expected. Harris received a call late one evening from an anonymous tipster. The voice on the other end was hushed, tense. The person claimed to know who was really responsible for the crash. It wasn't an accident, they said, their voice shaking. It was meant to happen. They're covering up a murder. Before Harris could respond, the line went dead. The investigation had just taken a dark turn. Who had planted the tip and why? Was it someone with knowledge of the crash, or was it just another false lead? As the night grew darker, so did the mystery. The deeper Harris and her team went, the more they realized this case was far from what it seemed. The next day, Detective Harris met with the anonymous tipster, determined to track down the truth. But when she arrived at the location specified, a dark alley behind an abandoned warehouse, no one was there. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. A sense of unease gnawed at her. Had the tipster been watching her? Had they been leading her into a trap? Just as Harris turned to leave, she spotted a crumpled note on the ground. She reached down, unfolding it carefully. The words written on it were brief, but they sent a chill down her spine. "You're getting too close." Meanwhile, Officer Lena Williams had been digging into the mayor's past. She'd uncovered a connection between Caldwell and a notorious underworld figure, a name that Harris had never expected to see, tied to the mayor. As she typed the name into her phone to send a message to Harris, her screen froze. The power went out. Panic set in for a moment as Lena looked around, only to hear footsteps approaching from behind her. When she turned, the only thing she saw was the shadow of a figure disappearing into the darkness. Who was following her? And why had the power gone out just as she was about to send the evidence? And then there was Greaves, who had been re-examining the wreckage at the crash site. He found something hidden deep in the underbrush, a blood-stained piece of clothing that didn't belong to the victim. But as he stood there staring at the piece of evidence in his hand, he was startled by a loud noise behind him. A flash of movement caught his eye. A figure, just out of sight. Was someone watching him? The investigation reached a boiling point when Detective Harris finally uncovered the missing piece of the puzzle. After hours of poring over old case files and cross-referencing witness testimonies, she stumbled upon a seemingly insignificant detail: a small scrap of paper found at the crash site. At first, it had appeared to be just another piece of litter, but something about the handwriting had caught her eye. Harris had it analyzed by the forensic team. The results sent a shock through her. The handwriting was a match to the mayor's personal notes. But why would he be involved in this case? And what did this piece of paper have to do with the woman's death? It wasn't long before Harris discovered that the note wasn't just a random scribble. It was a cryptic message, a warning perhaps, written in code. After hours of deciphering, the message revealed an address. She wasted no time. At 2 a.m., she and Officer Williams drove to the location on the outskirts of the city, a dilapidated mansion long abandoned. As they approached, Harris's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the place where everything had gone wrong. When they entered the mansion, their flashlights illuminated the dusty old walls, and the atmosphere was suffocating. But as they explored deeper into the house, they discovered something that would change everything. Tucked behind a boarded-up door, Harris found a hidden room, and inside, the truth was finally laid bare. A wall of photographs and documents covered the space, detailing connections between the mayor, the victim, and a secretive criminal syndicate. But what was most shocking was the image of a young boy. The same boy who had heroically pulled the woman from the wreckage. His connection to the mayor was more than just casual. It was deeply personal. As the pieces finally fell into place, Harris felt a sense of unease. How had the boy been involved? And what was his role in all of this? The revelation shook her to the core. Someone so close to the mayor had been pulling the strings all along. The moment that would forever change the course of the investigation came when Detective Harris sat across from the victim's family. Her heart heavy, she prepared herself to reveal the shocking truth, the web of lies, deceit, and betrayal that had spiraled into tragedy. Mrs. Simmons, the victim's mother, had been holding on to the hope that the truth about her daughter's death was simple, that it was a tragic accident. But as Harris spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of the words. "There's more to this than what we initially thought," Harris began. "Your daughter wasn't just a victim of a reckless driver. She was caught up in something much bigger." Mrs. Simmons's face contorted in confusion. "What do you mean? Who would hurt my baby like that?" Harris hesitated before continuing. "The mayor, the same man who was publicly mourning your daughter's death, has been connected to a secret criminal network. And your daughter? She was involved in trying to stop it." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Simmons's eyes filled with tears, her shoulders trembling with disbelief. No, that can't be true. My girl, she was just trying to live her life. She didn't deserve this." But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear. The victim had uncovered dangerous secrets that threatened the mayor's empire, secrets he would stop at nothing to keep hidden. And worse, the boy, the one who had risked everything to save her, wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was the mayor's son. The revelation hit the family like a tidal wave. Mrs. Simmons cried uncontrollably, clutching her daughter's photo to her chest. Her grief wasn't just for the life lost, but for the knowledge that her daughter's death had been orchestrated in a game much darker than she could have ever imagined. The weight of this truth also fell heavily on Detective Harris. She had started this case thinking she was fighting for justice, but now she understood just how personal it had become. The stakes were no longer about solving a crime. They were about confronting the darkness of power, corruption, and a family's destruction. Harris felt the pull of it all, and it took everything in her to stay composed, to keep pushing forward when the emotional weight was so unbearable. The pressure was mounting, and every character in this tangled web had to make a decision that could alter the course of their lives. Detective Harris sat alone in her office late one evening, the weight of the case pressing down on her. The discovery that the mayor's son was involved in the crime had left her torn. She knew the truth, but bringing it to light meant exposing a system of corruption that could destroy the city's political infrastructure. The moral dilemma was suffocating. Should she pursue the truth at all costs, or protect the people who depended on the stability of the city? She thought of Mrs. Simmons and the other grieving families, people who had been kept in the dark, their suffering exacerbated by the lies and cover-ups. How could she stand by and allow this corruption to continue? But revealing the truth would also put everyone involved at great risk, including herself. Meanwhile, the mayor's son, Nathan, sat in his luxurious apartment, his mind racing with fear. He knew the investigators were closing in on him, but confessing would mean a life in prison. He was at a crossroads, keep the family's secret safe, or risk losing everything for a chance at redemption. Finally, Mrs. Simmons, in her quiet mourning, had to make her own choice. Should she fight for the truth about her daughter's death, even if it meant exposing a man she had once trusted? Her grief turned into a deep, gut-wrenching decision. How far was she willing to go for justice, knowing the consequences? The truth finally broke through the fog of secrecy. Detective Harris, after weeks of navigating the dangerous line between justice and loyalty, made the gut-wrenching decision to expose Nathan's involvement in the crime. With a final push from the victim's family, whose resolve to seek justice was unwavering, the case moved into the courtroom. The community was shaken as the mayor's son, once a figure of public adoration, stood before a judge, accused of heinous crimes. The trial was tense and dramatic. The public revelation of Nathan's involvement sent shockwaves throughout the city as people realized how deeply the corruption ran. Nathan, once so confident in his family's power, had lost everything. The court proceedings were emotional, and the media attention was relentless. The victim's family, especially Mrs. Simmons, watched with mixed emotions, grief for the loss of their loved one, but also a sense of justice finally being served. They had waited for years, but now they could finally see the truth unfold. The investigation team, now applauded for their perseverance, could finally breathe. Harris, particularly, felt the weight of the case lift off her shoulders, but she knew that exposing the truth had come at a personal cost. As the trial ended and the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, there was a sense of finality. Nathan was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his life shattered by his own choices. The victim's family, though forever scarred by the loss, found solace in the resolution. It wasn't the end of their grief, but it was a step toward healing. The community, forever altered by the corruption that had been unveiled, began to rebuild. While justice had been served, the reverberations of the truth would be felt for years to come. The victim's family, though forever scarred, slowly began their journey toward healing. Mrs. Simmons, in particular, found solace in knowing that her daughter's death was no longer shrouded in secrecy. The trial's closure allowed her to grieve with a sense of justice, though she knew the pain of her loss would never fully fade. The family, after years of torment, began to rebuild their lives, choosing to honor the memory of their loved one by supporting victims' rights organizations. Detective Harris, having solved the case that had consumed her for months, found herself at a crossroads. While the truth had been uncovered, the emotional toll weighed heavily on her. She had sacrificed so much in pursuit of justice, and though her career had reached a high point with this victory, she often wondered if it was worth the personal cost. She took a brief sabbatical from her work, searching for a way to reconnect with her own humanity. As for Nathan, his downfall was swift and absolute. Behind bars, he was stripped of everything: his family, his wealth, his freedom. His sense of superiority vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of his actions. In the end, the price of his arrogance was a life sentence, and with it, the destruction of everything he had once held dear. In the end, justice was served, but the question remains, was it enough? For every life taken, for every wound inflicted, can the legal system ever truly heal the damage done? Nathan's conviction brought an end to the investigation. But what about the scars left behind? The family, though given justice, was forever changed by the trauma, and Detective Harris despite her victory, was left to question the true cost of uncovering the truth. Sometimes the answers we seek only lead to more complex questions. Is there ever truly closure when the wounds run so deep? This case, though closed, serves as a reminder of the complexities of human nature, crime, and justice. While the perpetrators may face consequences, the emotional toll remains. The scars of the past do not easily fade, and as time moves on, questions linger. Will those left behind ever fully recover? And what of those who seek justice at any cost? Do they too carry their own burden? In the pursuit of truth, sometimes the greatest mystery is the one left within ourselves.